today, what I really want to focus on is the concept of strategic alternatives. At the end of the day, as a business owner, when you get to the point in your life where you're going to begin to explore alternatives for your business, what do I do with it? Do I pass it down to my kids? Do I do a recap with a private equity firm? Do I sell to a strategic acquirer? That's kind of exploring strategic alternatives. Until you get into a formal competitive sale process, it's really hard to understand what the business is worth. Typically, what I always advise POTOMAC clients is when you go out to market, you cast a wide enough net so that you get price discovery. You bring in private equity firms, you bring in strategic acquirers, you bring in a variety of players. You want to get enough participants in the sale process so that you really get what we call price discovery. So that ultimately, when you pull the trigger, you really have a good, solid feeling that you got the absolute best price that you could have gotten for the business. Value is subjective. Every market participant is going to value an asset differently than another market participant. You might have a large publicly traded company that really wants to get into a certain market, and your business is the answer to that question. Whereas another acquirer might say your business is a nice to have, but really they're not going to go out of their way to get it. And the only way to really flush that value out is run a competitive process. So mistake number one is believing that price is objective, that there's a going rate for a type of business in the market. That's mistake number one. Mistake number two is not running a formal process. If you have one buyer, not only do you not get price discovery, but you also find yourself in a very, very risky position, right? Because you have no fallback. At least if you go out into a formal process and deal with 30 acquirers, sure, there might be only one that's going to pay you, I don't know, let's make this up, 50 million bucks, right? But there might be two that are going to pay you 48 million bucks. And when you get into an environment like we are today where multiples are contracting, it's far better to have two $48 million offers than going for the 50 and having nothing. So you always want to run a competitive process. The biggest mistake that I see sellers make is selling their business without running a competitive process. How do you determine whether or not you want to do a private equity deal versus a strategic deal? Well, a private equity transaction is ideal for somebody who's younger, who wants to pull some equity out of the business, wants to maybe sell 60, 70, 80% of the business, retain some equity, take on some sophisticated outside investors, grow the business, and then of course exit it at some point in the future. So that's really the private equity recap model. Now, in residential services, pest, lawn, various other services, you see growth investors. And growth investors are private equity firms that say, hey, we don't want to own the majority of this business. We want to invest. We want to buy 20% of your business, 40% of your business, and we want you to be part of our ecosystem. So your business gets pulled into our portfolio. You get to learn from our digital marketing specialists, our advertising specialists, our folks that are great at HR and all these different things. You get to hang out with other CEOs in our portfolio. And at some point, we're going to exit that investment, but we don't want to be in control of it. Now, we'll take a board seat or two, but at the end of the day, you're in control. That's a growth investment. We see these, we don't see these nearly as much as we see control or control recaps from private equity. The typical private equity firms that invest in pest and lawn and HVAC tend to be controlled private equities. When we think about the strategic transaction, the strategic transaction is the large publicly traded or the private equity-backed firm that comes in and says, I want to buy 100% of your business. 95% of transactions are strategic deals, at least in residential and commercial services space. Now, that has changed in recent years. There's more and more private equity, but at the end of the day, the strategic deal is 100% change of control. You hand all of your shares or all the assets of your business, you take your cash, you're typically out the door. The only way to really understand what the best option for you is to run that actual process. You run a controlled auction process, or you run a competitive process, and you deal with strategics. And you run a private equity process simultaneously. I think the most important thing when you think about strategic alternatives is price is not objective, it's subjective. run a formal process. Again, it's not a pitch for my services. I've said this on the Boardroom Buzz before. You can have your 18-year-old niece run a formal process, and it will be better for you than dealing with only one acquirer. Thank you for joining me this afternoon.